Okay, so welcome to Return the Sacred. My name is Coleen Rajotte, and joining me today is Gerald Neufeld. He is an advocate for returning the Swiss artifacts back to Turtle Island. Also joining us today is John Moses. He is the former director from the Museum of Natural Canadian Museum of History in Ottawa. And we will also have some people logging in to give us some of their feedback on all of these efforts that are underway to return all of these Indigenous artifacts back to Turtle Island. So because this is our first episode of Return the Sacred, I just wanted to introduce myself. As mentioned, my name is Coleen Rajotte, and I am Cree. I grew up here in Winnipeg, and I wear a lot of hats in this life. I started my career as a journalist at CBC Television, and I was a television reporter that traveled all over North America, covering some of the biggest stories of the day. I then moved into independent television production and have produced hundreds of hours of programs for CBC, for APTN. I've made independent documentary films. I co-founded the Winnipeg Aboriginal Film and Video Festival. So I wear a lot of hats, and I have been a storyteller all of my life. And in grade 1, I asked my grade 1 teacher if I could write a little book. So one of my first projects as just a little kid was I wrote a little storybook, and they even bound it for me. And I still have that little book. So I've been writing and telling stories ever since I could print my name. So joining me today is Gerald Neufeld. And Gerald, could you introduce yourself?
Certainly. First of all, thanks for having me. And so my background is I grew up in Pongassi First Nation, which is on the Upper Barons River on the east side of Manitoba, nestled up against the Ontario border. It's a smaller community. It was during the time that I lived there. It was a monolingual community in Ojibwe, and the first school had only started in that community a few years prior to me living there. And so I was very engaged in the life of the Anishinaabe, and my street language was Ojibwe, and so I got very comfortable with it. Unfortunately, it's one of those things you don't use it, you lose it over time, and the decades go on, and I'm not as proficient in the language as I used to be. Um, with my family, we moved south in the early '70s, and so there was a time period that I didn't go back. But I can tell you that for the last 50 years, 55 years, I have made regular trips back to my hometown. I love that place. It's the place I go to rest my spirit, my soul, and my friends still live there. And I've got into a lot of research for the Upper Barons River region, and a lot of it is in the genealogy area. And I can tell you that these artifacts fit right into this because it's the style of life that people lived back then, which these sacred items that we're talking about here today were part of an everyday life. And the one thing I've done in the Upper Barons River region is I've done a lot of presentations from the research that I've done to provide them the information to understand what their heritage is, going back to the time of the signing of the treaty in 1876, which is the adhesion to Treaty Number 5, August 4, 1876, a very important date. And a date like that is often not known these days. And I'm trying to build awareness of that, just as Coleen and I are working on trying to build the awareness around these artifacts. It's the same formula, and it's part of heritage. There was nothing more compelling for me than that day when I did a presentation in Pikangikum. I've done hundreds and hundreds in these communities, by the way, but that one evening in Pikangikum, where I did the presentation to the public audience, and at the end of it was about an hour and a half presentation, and there was three women, probably in their 50s, approached me with crocodile tears in their eyes, and they were talking about Osawachi. And Osawachi was their great grandfather. They'd never seen a photograph of him, and I had one. I found one. It was given to me by a conduit from uh, the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, a photograph taken in the 1930s by Dr. A. Irving Hallowell. And there he was, a photograph of a great grandfather they'd heard so much about, and now they could see what he looked like. And so, those stories that go on and on. There's just so many of them. So that's a bit of the background. I'm here. Very happy to be here. Very happy to be part of this whole effort.
So Gerald was part of the, I guess, kind of, you were the first person to hear that this private Swiss collector had thousands of these items over in Switzerland. So Gerald, along with Dakota Teepee councillor Carl Stone, went to Switzerland last summer to visit the museum and meet the private collector, Vincent Escriba, to, see just exactly what he held in this collection. And Gerald, so you were there and you have photographs. Can you just explain to everyone listening the magnitude of this collection and all of these beautiful sacred items that are still so far away from home?
Well, I can tell you that the day that I walked in with the other people in my group, there was about 6 or 7 of us. I was overwhelmed as I walked into the um, museum, realizing the, I guess, the magnitude, the number of artifacts. Although I didn't at that time necessarily have an idea that it was in the range of 10,000. I didn't really know how many to expect. And the first wall that we saw was a wall with slippers. And here, for example, is a photograph of some of those slippers. And the very nicely positioned on the in the cabinet. And then the nations that were represented by these slippers were written there, and it was the Dakota, the Nakota, Lakota. These are what we commonly know as the Sioux. There was the Kiowa, there was the Apache, and it was just a very large display case with very many slippers. And these are slippers that clearly have had a lot of intricate handwork done to make them. And these are 1800s vintage for the most part. And as we walked around through the corridor, there was just around the corner was this eagle staff, and it's an eagle staff owned by the chief Jack Red Cloud, and it's purported that he was one of the leaders in the battle against General Custer. And so I'll show this photograph again. On your left side, you'll see some bags that are in a cabinet in behind the eagle staff, and it gives you a sense of, like, from a three-dimensional standpoint. Immediately surrounding this whole area where the eagle staff is are other artifacts from this, a lot of them from the Sioux Nation right in there. Just such detailed information. This eagle staff is probably about over 2 meters high, and it's the one that a leader would be holding in his hand as a staff, signaling the leadership position that he's in. As I understand it, from what Carl has described, Carl Stone was in our delegation, and he is Dakota, and he knows a lot about these things. And it would be he would be the leader, and the people that are with him would be looking toward him for direction as to what the next steps might be. He would be leading the people into battle. There's things like this bandolier. This bandolier is Ojibwe. It's an Ojibwe, and you can see the floral designs on there, which are a dead giveaway to Algonquin style of artistry. And this is a mid 1700s bandolier. Those bands go around the shoulder. They're probably about 8 inches wide. The bottom part has I'll show this again. It's got a small pocket in that lower piece, and that's where ammunition and powder was probably held. This would be carried by men. Again, if you look just directly to your left-hand side in the bottom corner, there's another piece of beaded artistry, and it shows again the floral design. And I point out the floral design because the Sioux artistry is very different. It's of the geometric design, and it so distinctively contrasts what the Algonquins used. There's also guns. These are purportedly some battle guns that might have been used in the Battle of Little Bighorn. And these are, there were many guns in this museum. There was a whole room full of guns and pistols. From what I understand in my lengthy discussion that I had with Vincent Describa, who's the current owner of these pieces, is that there's probably about 4 or 5 that have evidence that they may have been actually used in the Battle of Little Bighorn. And so some of the challenges we'll have as we work our way through the whole final evaluation, if we get into negotiating, is to determine what we might want to do with some of these. Here's another photograph, a Cheyenne baby.
So Gerald, just to
Sure.
sorry. So Vincent Escriba, the owner, is asking anywhere from 13 to $20 million for all of these items. I'm just going to bring John Moses into the conversation. He's the former director. He's now retired from the Canadian Museum of History in Ottawa. And here we go. Hello, John. Welcome.
Hi, how are you doing? You can see me and hear me okay?
We can see and hear you perfectly. Were you able to hear Gerald's description of so many of these beautiful items? What is your reaction to this vast collection of items that are in Switzerland?
Well, I guess I shouldn't be surprised by anything any longer, but it's just a real wake-up call to all of us who work within the Indigenous repatriation space about what remains out there in private hands. I think for 20 years, 30 years and longer, people who are involved in museum and heritage work, especially Indigenous experts on Indigenous issues who are working within museum and heritage work, understand that great strides have begun to be made relative to the repatriation of important Indigenous ancestor belongings from public museums and public collections, whether these exist within North American borders or exist internationally or globally. But as we're seeing now, I think we're just starting to scratch the surface of what is out there remaining within private hands, private collections, perhaps corporate collections that unless the owners choose to do so, they're not publicly known. And so that's something that this particular situation really brings to the forefront. And just a very quick qualification: I retired last year from the Canadian Museum of History as their director of repatriation and Indigenous relations. So I'm doing independent consulting work right now for museums and heritage organizations. But yeah, I think that's for me. That's the bottom line in this particular situation. It's a case in point. It's a teachable moment regarding the existence of important collections of Indigenous ancestor belongings that remain within private or corporate collections, as opposed to those that are relatively well known and that appear in publications and online and so forth. Thanks.
And John, what are some of the challenges involved in trying to repatriate items from a private collection, because these are not in a public institution in Switzerland?
Yeah, well, I think we'll be learning these as we go along. A lot of this will be dependent upon the goodwill of the current owners, or the persons or corporations within whose stewardship these ancestor belongings currently reside. But it's one thing to talk about the typical features or attributes of a repatriation policy that you might expect to encounter with a public museum or a national museum. A lot of that will not apply when we're dealing with private collectors and within the realm of private art collecting, because there is a growing movement of amongst private collectors themselves, this notion that property rights are human rights, and individuals or groups of people working together have the right to acquire and hold property. And by extension, this includes collections of cultural property. So we really are entering into new territory here. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. We did some research, and in California right now, there's some new laws that have been passed, and they are basically saying that everything should be returned back by 2029, I believe, and different museums are in the process of returning Indigenous items to the respective peoples that they belong to. What do you think of that? Because in this case, some of these items are from the United States, so it adds another layer of complexity that these new laws might apply to part of this private collection. Any thoughts on that?
Well, again, this is, ultimately, this is the kind of situation wherein the lawyers and attorneys have to be involved in sort of these basic legal questions as to the extraterritorial application of a law. For example, like if we're talking about the federal NAGPRA legislation in the United States, the Native American Grave Protection and Repatriation Act, or the National Museum of the American Indian Act and its repatriation features, to what extent, if any, are these applicable outside the the physical boundaries of the United States, or indeed within Canadian borders. There are major institutions, including again the Canadian Museum of History, do have their own repatriation policy. But to what example that policy obviously pertains only to the holdings of the Canadian Museum of History. There are features of it, best practices and lessons learned, that might be applied in the case of private collections. But again, we're ultimately depending upon the goodwill of those private collectors to sort of incorporate those best practices and lessons learned, and to make them, internalize them in respect of their own collections. So typically we're talking about, the term that's often used is this notion of a criteria-based repatriation policy that prioritizes the return of specified categories of material culture, if you will, that historically have been identified by Indigenous peoples ourselves as being the priority items for return. And at the top of that list, almost without exception, is the issue of Indigenous human remains and associated burial materials, followed by items of a sacred ceremonial or ritual nature, and then extending on downwards to items that are items of outstanding cultural patrimony or matrimony, based upon their unique features, or property owned in common, in the sense that we might be talking about items, Indigenous ancestor belongings, that yes, indeed, do have one particular person who is assigned as their caregiver and their steward for a particular period of time, but that person is not to be considered the owner of that belonging, merely the custodian on behalf of the community as a whole.
Mm-hmm. So Gerald has actually spoken to the private collector recently. The private collector's name is Vincent Escriba. And Gerald, can you give us any updates on what Mr. Escriba is saying now about the price and where he's at this moment?
Well, it's first of all, it's clear to me that Mr. Escriba is committed to helping us find a way to get these back to Turtle Island. And he made that statement very clearly when we were there last year in July, almost exactly a year ago. And that his wording is consistent with that today. So I'm very gratified with that. One thing that does scare me is that as we go down this path, I think one of the slow realizations that's coming to the forefront, at least for me, is that this is probably one of the larger repatriation efforts that's probably happening in North America at this point in time. There's complexities, as you've described, John, regarding differences in legislation between the United States and Canada. And I do believe that we'll come to a point where we'll have partners we will be wanting to participate in helping us bring these back to Turtle Island. But it seems to me that there's going to be a gentleness needed in handling Mr. Escriba, because the easy path for him is to take his products to market just as he originally bought them, and that's an easy financial transaction to make. I think that what we're doing is we're setting him up here for, it's my impression that we're probably setting him up for more difficult in some ways from his standpoint than he otherwise might have.
And just to give some background, we looked into some of the prices that he could fetch on say a private auction site, and guns that were used in the Battle of Bighorn have sold for up to $675,000 US. Sacred pipes used in ceremony have been sold for up to $100,000 US. So there's a fear that if the money, we can't raise this money to pay Mr. Escriba, he could very well start auctioning these off piece by piece. And that's really, I think our worst fear is that some rich billionaire from Dubai or New York is going to buy one of these items and display it in their office as a trophy item. So John, can you give us any insight into how we can find somebody to go to Switzerland and not only appraise the collection, but authenticate it and sort of help us come up with a fair market price? Like, any thoughts on that whole process?
Yeah. Well, there's an increasing number of university-based Indigenous academics who are, specialists across the spectrum of the museum and heritage related disciplines. So presumably outreach could be done with some web-based groups like GRASAC, which is the Great Lakes Research Alliance, that is based, I believe, out of the University of Toronto, I think it is. It has numerous expert advisors on board, including many Indigenous experts on these matters. And then also potentially the current membership of the Canadian Cultural Property Export Review Board. I know a number of these, the current members are people who are experienced within the private art market and sort of move within that realm. And, from time to time, we are aware through media coverage and, various other stories that are out there of individual persons who have taken it upon themselves to acquire things at private auction themselves so that they might return these at least within Canadian borders, or the Great Turtle Island borders, if we're talking in North American terms more generally. But I think there are people out there. It's a sort of a sub project in its own right, is to spread the word and to approach organizations like GRASAC and other bodies and individual persons themselves who are known to have created their own body of experience around these matters.
Yeah. Speaking about getting the word out, this story has received international media attention and getting a lot of feedback from the public. And one of those people is Suzanne McCree, and she is a Winnipeg. She lives here in Winnipeg, very outspoken community member. And Suzanne, you had some comments because you listened to this story and you were a little bit outraged in some way. What are your thoughts?
Kind of more than a little, I guess, but yes. So, I'm an artist, I'm a visual artist, and I'm a filmmaker, and I have a background in broadcast journalism, so, researching and so on. But most importantly for this probably is that I have an activist background in strategic campaigns, and I'm the executive director and a founder of Boreal Action, which was founded to do support work for grassroots Indigenous-led campaigns to protect traditional territories from large-scale resource extraction. So I've been doing that kind of work for decades, and my mind immediately goes to strategic thinking, in terms of course, there's plenty of reason to be outraged about this, but more importantly, how do you get it back? I guess that's where my brain goes immediately. And there's all these ideas out there, and I've heard this expressed at the University of Manitoba for the repatriation that they're doing also with artwork. And it should cultural items depend on a market value, and of course they shouldn't. But the reality is that with a private collection like this, the only way to get it back is to purchase it. And so, where's the money going to come from? I guess that's there's no federal mechanism in Canada for a private collection. I actually listened very closely to what John said, because I was also looking into the differences in the U.S. and Canada, and then we've got transboundary issues, and it's not a simple fix, but I mean, clearly it's urgent. This man wants to divest himself of this collection, and yes, he may be amenable and prefer to try to repatriate these items, but when it comes down to it, he's made a huge financial investment in them too. And so the urgency is there to find the money to get them back. And yes, like itemizing them and trying to come up with some kind of value would be great. But in the end, he's going to have an asking price, and that money has to be made available somehow. So, how do we leverage the money? And it may come from a bunch of different sources, but I think that's where the pressure point has to be focused right now, quite urgently, if this has been going on for a year.
Yeah.
And Gerald, did you want to comment on that? Are you feeling the pressure that time is ticking down in terms of Mr. Escriba possibly selling some of these items off one by one?
I definitely feel that pressure. I felt the pressure back in the middle of July last year that we didn't have, the time wasn't entirely on our side. And we've taken a number of steps since then to try and find a formula that would be able to get us the money that we were looking for. And the first thing we did when we came back was we took to the premier, spoke to the premier, and tried to get into the office of a senior cabinet minister, and we didn't get anywhere with that. The next step was to try and contact individual people who might find themselves in a philanthropic position to build philanthropic position to help us out with coming up with the capital requirements here. And again, so far to no avail. And so now we're, sequentially, we're moving down that path, but also we're making some progress in terms of starting to ferret out those alternatives that aren't working so well. So I'm very happy that we're here today. But in the meantime, the time has marched on. We've used up a whole year. And so it's wonderful that we still have, let's say, 6 months before now in the end of the calendar year to be able to make perhaps make a significant progress on the budget amount that we need. But the reality is that there's pressure on us. There's no doubt about it, because Mr. Escriba, he's 67 or 68 years old. He has expressed he would like to see us make leaps and bounds. Those were his words in one of the letters I received from him, leaps and bounds on progress. And he's also reaffirmed his desire to retire. And one can't stop a person from having that desire, and we can't stop time. So yes, we have a challenge here before us.
Yeah. And just for background, I was just going to add that this Mr. Vincent Escriba, he spent 2 decades collecting these items. He made numerous trips to the United States. He had a day job, but he spent, as he told Gerald, many of his evenings operating this museum. So, I think that he feels that he's put a lot into this collection. So he wants to get some, it's a large monetary value back for his retirement. And sorry, John, you were going to add?
Well, yeah, I was just going to add in terms of, if what we're talking about here is sort of the fundraising campaign and the necessity of a fundraising campaign, we need a hook. We need a soundbite, basically. And I mentioned this in one of the, a previous meeting. I think we can maximize our leverage if we make a connection between lands and resources and the residential schools, and then what we're doing now with the collections of Indigenous ancestor belongings. Because for me, fundamentally, it's all about land back, children back and accounted for, and
Mhm.
Indigenous ancestor belongings back. Because when you look at it, just as natural resources were historically being removed from within traditional Indigenous territories to be sold off within Western markets, and just as children were being removed to residential schools for the purposes of assimilation, too so were cultural resources, i.e., individually and collectively, these groups of Indigenous ancestor belongings were being removed to public and private collections, not just nationally or within North American borders, but as we see around the world. So I would suggest that we come up with some sort of a hook or soundbite that tries to capture this sentiment of land back, children
Mhm.
back and accounted
Mhm.
for, and Indigenous ancestor belongings back, because they're all intertwined. They're all of a piece in that sense. So that's my my 2 cents on that issue.
And John, are you
Well,
aware of any
repatriation
efforts?
also is one of the, sorry,
I was just going to ask
speaking
John,
out of
are
turn
you?
as usual.
Yeah, yeah, no worries. I was just wondering, John, are you aware of any efforts where people have raised a significant amount of money and brought a private collection back to Canada?
Well, it's happened historically within the government itself, going back to the decade of the 1970s. There was the there was a big exhibition that was ultimately held at National Museum of Man back in the day, and it was a collection that was acquired by a wealthy German collector of that time. And this is back in the 1970s. The government of Canada was able to step in to provide emergency funding to purchase this material and have it repatriated, and being repatriated in the sense that, if nothing else, it was being repatriated within Canadian borders, because of that, most of that material today, or much of it, still remains at the Canadian Museum of History. But this was the Spire collection, and the spelling on that is Speyer. Anybody who's on the meeting can do a Google search on the Spire collection and the extraordinary efforts that the government of Canada was able to resort to back in the decade of the 1970s to secure emergency federal funding such that this material could be purchased en masse from the collector, Mr. Spire, before it was dissembled individually, sold off piece by piece at different art markets or auction houses. So essentially, exactly the same kind of situation that we're talking about here. So again, the other organization that we need to be reaching out to is the Cultural Property Export Review Board, and seeing what, if any, elements of the Cultural Property Export and Import Act might be applicable in this kind of situation. So the
Do
other
you
thing we
happen
have
to?
to consider too, and this is potentially a secondary fundraising project in its own right, once the material is back, if and hopefully when the material comes back within Canadian borders, what is the physical repository? What is the place of safekeeping where everything can be assembled for whatever period of time necessary is that work? And this could, given the amount of material, this could take years and years to get sorted. Where is it going to be held upon arrival back within Canadian borders?
I'd like to
Yes,
make a comment on that, if I might.
yeah, yeah. Go ahead,
Yes.
Gerald.
Okay, so the thing that certainly comes to mind here is that in the conversations we're having with people from the Indigenous side, is that there are strong undercurrents that are suggesting that, to me, that we're not talking about transferring these articles from a museum into another museum, and I like the looseness of your wording, the way you described it, John. But it's more of a healing type of a thing. These are belongings. These are live beings. These are ones that, over the span of time that they've been sitting in museums, they haven't had the proper treatment from a spiritual standpoint. They're live beings. They're sacred, and so what needs to happen is that they need to come back, and they need to be reconnected, not only with their people, but with the souls of the items themselves. And that's something that's come out very loud and clear, that museums don't do that. They're put under the display case and they're there for people to look at. But that's not what we're looking for. We're looking for our future. Like so, let me just take a step back here for where I was going, and then I'll come back to this. The artifacts in a museum are ones that give you the sense of what history was all about, and it puts it into a freeze motion, bringing them back into the live beings and into the hands of those from which they were taken. This is something that's an investment into the future, the healing for the people. So it's a very different paradigm, I think, and I think it's an important distinction. And I think that's the direction that that we see ourselves. We're not leading this. It's the Indigenous people who are leading us down this path. They're the ones who are speaking in the background, and I love the fact that finally their voices are being heard. It's not that it's just being sold for $1 or $5 to them back 100 years ago or 50 years ago, and now it's on display for an entrepreneur. These are actually live beings which are coming back to their home, the part of the family.
And yeah, certainly important points as well. And within conventional museums and heritage organizations, there's a growing awareness of that too. So there are a couple of points, in no particular order. So I would agree that as important as repatriation is, it's most properly understood as but one Indigenous engagement outcome for institutions and for collections alongside a spectrum of other Indigenous engagement outcomes. So if we're talking about conventional museums of what are other size, like small local and regional museum operations, or provincial and territorial or national museums, quite aside from repatriation needing to occur, there also needs to be Indigenous internship opportunities to train up Indigenous museum specialists across the range of the museum disciplines. There needs to be Indigenous artist in residence programs who can look at these historic belongings through a contemporary lens. And then there also needs to be a scope there for the incorporation of traditional Indigenous caregiving practices within institutions and within collections, such that this comes to be seen as just an ordinary, routine, and perhaps uniquely Canadian and Indigenous approach to museum and collections care in Canada, wherein traditional care is seen as an ordinary and routine part of collections care in general, such that things like smudging ceremonies, pipe ceremonies, ritual food preparation and consumption, they're no longer seen as potential threats to the collection and staff that need to be managed by museum officials, but as opportunities for truth and reconciliation in their own rights. So, that's part of the issue there too. And I would emphasize language as well, because with many, in my experience, many of the Indigenous groups and organizations, Indigenous self-governments that I've dealt with over the years, when it gets right down to it, Indigenous peoples don't passively accept museums and their disciplines as unquestioned social goods. For many Indigenous groups, they're more interested in getting to the bottom of the circumstances under which these ancestor belongings came to leave Indigenous hands in the first place. And again, this circles back to this notion of land back, children back, and belongings back. And when you get right down to it, their primary cultural heritage concern is not necessarily with groups of things, of ancestor belongings, as important as those might be, but their main priority is language retention and language revitalization. So we need to be able to tie that into this issue into this triumvirate of land back, children back, and belongings back. We need to have a language back aspect to this too, because part of what's being lost historically, when these belongings were being removed from communities, it wasn't just the physical object itself that was being lost to the community. There was all these specialized Indigenous language vocabularies associated with the raw materials of manufacture, different ceremonial songs and chants that might have been sung or chanted as the belonging was actually being made from the raw materials, and all the rest of it. So there's a strong language component to this too that we need to flesh out somehow.
Just further on that, Carl Stone from Dakota Teepee First Nation, he speaks so well about that point, seeing ceremonial pipes under glass in Switzerland, and, a pipe has a spirit and should be feasted and taken care of. There's protocols, and there are museums now that are Indigenous-led museums that are following those protocols and taking care of sacred items in the proper way. So Carl is unfortunately on vacation this week, but he talked so with such emotion about seeing some of these items under glass in Switzerland, almost like they're trapped there. They're away from their people. So as Gerald has spoken about these items, both Gerald and Carl have seen these items. They just need to come back, and I 100% agree with you, John. Everything should come back.
I would say as well that in that exact context that we see this from a bringing them home standpoint as just the first opportunity. There are more. There's going to be many more, and there is a need for bringing them home, and more of them will surface.
Mm-hmm.
Any closing thoughts, Suzanne, on this very complex process to get all of these items back to Turtle Island?
Well, mostly I'm listening at this point and kind of trying to get up to speed and taking direction. But I certainly think that one place that emphasis needs to be placed right now is exactly the language and the way that this is presented in terms of leveraging money. Like you say, slogan kind of relating this to all the other recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation. For example, repatriation is in there, and connecting all of the various issues. They're all one issue, and finding a way to communicate that. And I don't think the rule should be for Indigenous people to have to go out and fundraise for this personally. I think there should be federal money available and it should just be a done deal, but it isn't. So we're going to have to find a way to leverage it. And I'd be happy to support in any way I can. But I think communicating it and it's probably going to be a multi-level fundraising campaign at this point. I don't think it's all going to come from one place likely. So I'd like to think on that and communicate with you more about it after this call and find ways that maybe I can plug in and help.
Okay, and John, any closing thoughts or recommendations on some of the next steps that should be taken?
Yeah, well, that would be my strongest recommendation with the view towards the fundraising efforts is that we need to, for marketing purposes, to be blunt, we need that hook, we need that soundbite, we need, for want of a better term, a slogan. And again, land back, children back and accounted for, ancestor belongings back, and language back. So,
okay, and Gerald, any closing thoughts on these very important efforts?
Well, I just really appreciate the comments and that you've shared here. It gives me the feeling that we're heading in the right direction, generally in the right direction. And this is what we need is feedback from folks such as yourself who can provide that. Thank you.
Okay, well, I'd just like to thank all of you for taking your time and joining us in this very important conversation. And we will keep everyone up to date, and we will keep in touch about the next steps. And once again, just thank you so much for joining us today on Return the Sacred.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye now. Have a good day.
Grazie,